Some men choose isolation. Others have it forced upon them. Dalton Creed thought he understood the difference until the day a woman appeared at his door carrying nothing but a leather suitcase and a piece of paper that would unravel 7 years of carefully constructed solitude. She was Apache. She was alone, and according to the document she held, she belonged to him. Except Dalton never sent for anyone, never signed anything, never wanted this. What he didn't know was that the woman standing on his porch was just as trapped as he was, that the paper in her hand was as much a prison as a promise, and that by sunset, both of them would face a choice that could mean survival or something far worse. Some arrivals change everything. This one would prove that the worst loneliness isn't being alone, it's being with someone and still feeling invisible. The knock came just after dawn, 3 sharp raps that shattered the silence Dalton had grown to depend on like air. He stood motionless in the center of his cabin, coffee cup halfway to his lips, listening to his heart hammer against his ribs in a way it hadn't in years. Nobody came out here. Nobody knew this place existed anymore. The second round of knocking was harder, more insistent, and Dalton set the cup down with a hand that trembled just enough to spill dark liquid across the worn wooden table. When he opened the door, the morning light was too bright, too sudden, and for a moment all he saw was a silhouette, impossibly tall against the pale sky. Then his eyes adjusted, and he saw her, a woman, Apache, from the beadwork and fringe, from the way she held herself like she was carved from the same stone as the mesas in the distance. She was younger than him by decades, strong in a way that made his own weathered frame feel suddenly frail. Her eyes swept over him once, assessing, finding him lacking, and then she lifted the suitcase at her side as if presenting evidence. Dalton Creed? Her voice was low, controlled, with an edge that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. He managed a nod, his throat too dry for words. She held out a folded paper, yellowed at the edges, creased from being carried too long. Then I believe this concerns you. Dalton's fingers were clumsy as he took it, unfolded it, saw handwriting he recognized but words that made no sense. An arrangement, a contract, his name signed at the bottom in ink he'd never touched. Vernon Hale's name as witness. The paper trembled in his grip as his mind raced to make sense of what he was reading. Mail order bride, terms of agreement, payment received. I never wrote this. The words came out rougher than he intended. I never sent for anybody. And yet here I am. She said it without emotion, stating a fact as immutable as the mountains behind her. Dalton looked past her, scanning the empty land stretching in every direction. No wagon, no horse, nothing but miles of nothing, and this woman who'd somehow crossed it alone. How did you even get here? I walked. She shifted her weight, and for the first time he saw the exhaustion she was hiding, the way her shoulders stayed rigid through sheer will. 3 days from the last town. I was told you were expecting me. Well, you were told wrong. He thrust the paper back at her, but she didn't take it, just stood there, immovable as the doorframe. I don't know what kind of mistake this is, but I didn't arrange this, didn't want this. Something flickered in her expression, too quick to read. Neither did I. The silence that followed was heavy with all the things neither of them would say. Dalton's mind was already calculating distances, impossibilities. 3 days on foot through territory that could break a man with a horse and supplies. She shouldn't have survived it. Shouldn't be standing here looking at him with eyes that held no plea. No desperation. Just a kind of cold evaluation that made him feel like he was the one being measured and found wanting. You need to leave. He said it as firmly as he could manage. Go back where you came from. With what? She asked. And for the first time there was something sharp beneath the calm. I was paid to come here. Every coin I had went into that payment. There is no going back. Dalton felt the trap closing around both of them, felt the weight of a decision he never asked to make. And then she said something that changed everything. Besides, Kaya's eyes fixed on something behind him, inside the cabin. That storm coming over the ridge will be here by nightfall. Neither of us will be going anywhere for a while. He turned to look where she was staring, saw the dark line of clouds building on the horizon like an approaching wall. When he turned back, she'd already picked up her suitcase and taken 1 step across his threshold. The question wasn't whether she was staying. It was whether he had any choice left at all. Kaya stepped inside without waiting for permission, and Dalton found himself moving backward into his own home like a guest retreating from the host. She set the suitcase down near the door with deliberate care, her eyes already cataloging the space with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to assess shelter for survival rather than comfort. The cabin was small, brutally spare. One room serving as kitchen, bedroom, and living space. A narrow cot against the far wall. A stone fireplace that hadn't seen a proper fire in months. Shelves holding more dust than supplies. "This is it?" She didn't say it with judgment, just stating an observation that made Dalton's face heat with something between shame and anger. "I don't entertain." He moved past her, putting the table between them like a barricade. "And I told you this is a mistake. Vernon Hale had no right to do whatever he did." "Who is Vernon Hale?" "My neighbor." Dalton gestured vaguely northwest. "Lives 2 days' ride from here. Used to check on me once a season before I told him to stop." He picked up the document again, staring at the signature that looked so much like his own. "This is forgery. Has to be." Kaya crossed to the window, her movements quiet despite her size. She studied the approaching storm with the focus of someone reading language in the weather. "When did you last see this Vernon?" 6 months. Maybe 8. Dalton tried to remember. Time had a way of blurring when every day looked the same. "He brought supplies I didn't ask for. Talked about how I needed help with the ranch. I told him to leave me alone. And so he sent me." Her voice was flat, but something underneath suggested she understood the cruel logic of it. Men like that believe they know better than the choices you make. The observation was too accurate. Too knowing, and Dalton found himself looking at her differently. Not as an intrusion, but as another person caught in someone else's plan. "You said you paid to come here." "Paid who?" Kaya turned from the window. "A man in Fort Defiance. He had papers, certificates. Said there were ranchers looking for wives through an arrangement service. Good men who needed help, who would provide protection and—" She paused, something bitter crossing her face. "A new life. That's what they told you?" Dalton felt anger rise, not at her, but at the whole rotten system that had put them both here. "And you believed it?" Her eyes hardened. "I believed it was better than the alternative." The words hung between them, heavy with implications Dalton wasn't ready to explore. He looked away first, moved to the fireplace, started building a fire he didn't know how to share. "The storm will last through tomorrow at least, maybe longer. You can stay until it passes. Then you'll need to find somewhere else." "Where?" The question was direct, surgical. "Back to Fort Defiance where the man who lied to me can do it to someone else? To the reservation where there's no land and no food and men who—" She stopped herself, jaw tight. "You don't want me here. I understand that. But pretending I have choices I don't have serves neither of us." Dalton struck the flint harder than necessary, watched sparks die before they could catch. "I'm not responsible for your situation. I didn't say you were." Kaya moved to her suitcase, unlatched it. Inside were folded clothes, a few personal items, and something wrapped in cloth that she kept her hand over protectively. "But we're both here now because of Vernon Hale's interference. Perhaps instead of fighting about who's more trapped, we should discuss how to survive until we're not." The fire finally caught, and Dalton straightened, his back protesting the movement. He was 57 years old, had lived alone so long he'd forgotten how to share space with another person. The cabin suddenly felt smaller than ever, the air thick with unspoken things and nowhere to escape them. "You take the cot," he heard himself say. "I'll sleep by the fire." Kaya's expression didn't change, but something in her posture relaxed fractionally. "Thank you. Don't thank me." Dalton moved toward the door, needing air even if it meant facing the approaching storm. "I'm not being kind. I'm just too tired to fight about everything in one day." He stepped out onto the porch, felt the first drops of rain hit his face like small warnings. Behind him, through the open door, he heard Kaya moving around his cabin with careful respect, and he wondered what exactly Vernon had written in that letter to her. What promises had been made? What lies told? The storm broke overhead with a crack of thunder that shook the walls, and Dalton realized with cold certainty that the next few days would test more than just his hospitality. They would test everything he'd built his isolation on, and he wasn't sure any of those foundations would hold. The storm didn't just arrive, it laid siege. By midday, the rain came sideways, turning the world beyond the windows into gray sheets of water that erased any boundary between earth and sky. Dalton had been through worse weather, but never with someone else depending on the shelter holding. He found himself checking the roof supports with anxious eyes, noting every creak and groan of wood he'd previously ignored. Kaya sat at the table, her hands busy with something Dalton couldn't quite see. She'd been quiet since morning, speaking only when necessary, and he'd been grateful for it. But as the hours dragged on, the silence became its own kind of pressure, filled with awareness of breathing and movement and the small sounds of two people trying not to take up too much space. A steady drip started near the corner by the cot, water finding its way through cedar shingles that needed replacing 2 years ago. Dalton grabbed the only bucket he had, positioned it to catch the leak. The hollow ping of water hitting metal was almost worse than the silence. The roof needs repair. Kaya's observation wasn't critical, just factual. Needed it for a while. Dalton checked the rest of the ceiling, looking for other weak points. Haven't had reason to fix it before now. You have been alone that long? She was working with leather strips now. He could see braiding them with quick, practiced movements that spoke of years of repetition. That you stopped maintaining your own shelter? The question cut closer than he liked. I maintain what matters. And the roof doesn't matter? She tied off the braid, started another. What about the corral fence? I saw it when I arrived. Half the rails are rotted through. Or the well cover, which has a gap large enough for anything to fall in and contaminate your water. Dalton felt his jaw tighten. You've been here less than a day and you're cataloging my failures? I'm cataloging what needs fixing. Kaya met his eyes without flinching. If I'm staying even a few days, I'd prefer not to drink fouled water or sleep under a roof that might collapse. Nobody asked you to stay at all. No, she returned to her braiding. But here we are. Another drip started, this one near the fireplace. Dalton swore under his breath, looked around for another container. There wasn't one. Kaya rose without a word, retrieved a shallow bowl from the shelf, placed it precisely under the leak. Her movements held the economy of someone who'd spent their life making do with less. How do you know about corral fences and well covers? Dalton asked before he could stop himself. I grew up on land my people worked before it was taken. Her voice was careful, controlled. We built shelters, maintained them, kept livestock when we were allowed to. I know what happens when structures fail. She paused, fingers still moving through the leather. And I know what it looks like when someone stops caring if they do. The words hung in the air between them, neither accusation nor pity, but something uncomfortably close to recognition. Dalton turned away, tended the fire to have something to do with his hands. You don't know anything about my situation. I know you've been alone long enough to let everything fall apart. Kaya's voice softened. Barely. I know that kind of alone. The kind where it stops mattering if you wake up or not. Something in Dalton's chest constricted. He kept his back to her, watching flames consume wood, thinking about the photograph he'd buried in a drawer 2 years ago because looking at it hurt more than forgetting. My wife and son died 7 years ago. Fever took them both in the same week. The braiding sound stopped. When Kaya spoke again, her voice carried weight that hadn't been there before. I had a daughter. She was 4 when the soldiers came. Dalton closed his eyes. He didn't ask what happened. Didn't need to. The fact that Kaya was here, alone, traveling to marry a stranger rather than return to her people, told him everything about what that sentence meant. Thunder cracked overhead, and a new leak opened up directly above the table, water splashing onto the document still lying there. Kaya grabbed it quickly, but the ink was already running, Vernon's forged signature bleeding into illegibility. She looked at it, then at Dalton, and something passed between them that wasn't quite understanding but was maybe the first hint of it. Tomorrow, she said quietly. When the rain slows, I'll patch the roof. You'll need to show me where you keep the pitch and tar. I can patch my own roof. Can you? She held up the ruined document. Or have you been letting everything wash away for so long you've forgotten how to hold things together? The question hit like a physical blow. Dalton wanted to argue, to defend the fortress of solitude he'd built around his grief. But as another leak started, and he had nowhere left to put a container, as he looked around at the cabin that had become less shelter and more tomb, he found he had no answer at all. Outside, the storm raged on, trapping them together in a space growing smaller by the hour. By dawn, the rain had softened to a steady drizzle, enough for Kaya to climb onto the roof with the tar bucket Dalton reluctantly retrieved from the shed. He stood below, watching her move across the wet shingles with a confidence that made his own careful living look like cowardice. She didn't ask for help, didn't wait for instruction, just assessed the damage and began working with the kind of efficiency that came from necessity rather than choice. You're going to break your neck up there, Dalton called up, hating how much he sounded like someone who cared. Then you'll have one less problem. She didn't look down, just kept spreading tar across the worst sections. her hands black with the substance. "Pass me more rags." He did, watching as she stuffed them into gaps and sealed them over. The work was crude but effective, the kind of repair that valued function over appearance. Within an hour, she'd stopped 3 leaks. Within 2, she'd reinforced sections he hadn't even known were failing. When she finally climbed down, her clothes were soaked through and streaked with tar. Dalton had coffee waiting, hot enough to burn, and she took it without comment. They stood on the porch together, not quite side by side, but no longer carefully distant, watching the gray world slowly reveal itself as the clouds began to thin. "You didn't have to do that." Dalton's voice was rougher than he intended. "Yes, I did." Kaya blew on the coffee, steam rising between them. "I don't accept shelter. I don't earn. Even shelter you didn't ask for? Especially then." She took a careful sip, and Dalton noticed the calluses on her hands, the small scars that told stories she'd never speak aloud. Dependency is its own kind of death. The words hit too close to something Dalton had been avoiding for years. He'd told himself his isolation was independence, but standing here with someone who actually understood the difference, he felt the lie of it settling heavy in his chest. "The corral fence," he heard himself say. "If you're right about the rot, I'll need help replacing the rails." It wasn't an invitation to stay, wasn't even a thank you, but Kaya's expression shifted fractionally, something that might have been respect crossing her features. "Show me where you keep the lumber." They worked through the afternoon, Dalton's body protesting every movement while Kaya seemed tireless. She didn't talk much, but when she did, it was practical. Measurements, angles. The best way to sink a post in ground still soft from rain. Dalton found himself listening not just to her words, but to the competence behind them, the kind of knowledge that came from building life from nothing over and over until you either learned or died. "Where did you learn this?" he asked as they fitted a new rail into place. "My husband." The words came flat, final, before the reservation, before everything. Dalton's hands stilled, another ghost in a conversation already crowded with them. "I didn't know you were married." "I'm not anymore." Kaya drove a nail with 3 precise strikes. "He died defending land we'd already lost. Soldiers said it was trespassing, that we had no right to be on property the government gave away to settlers." She reached for another nail. "My daughter was with him." The hammer hung in Dalton's grip, suddenly too heavy. He thought about his own loss, the fever that took his family while he was away getting medicine that arrived too late. But at least death had been impersonal, an act of nature rather than choice. What Kaya described was something darker, more deliberate. "I'm sorry." "Don't be." She moved to the next post. "Sorry doesn't rebuild anything." They finished the corral in silence, and when the last rail was secure, Dalton stepped back to survey their work. The fence looked better than it had in years. Sturdy, intentional, the kind of thing that suggested someone might be planning to use it again. "I have 3 horses," he said, not looking at her. "Been letting them run wild because I couldn't be bothered to pen them proper. If you're going to be here a few more days, we might as well bring them in. Make sure they're sound." Kaya wiped her hands on her already ruined dress. "I'll need to see your tack. Check for rot there too. You always this relentless about maintenance? You always this resistant to keeping things alive?" She met his eyes, and there was challenge there, but also something else. Understanding, maybe, or recognition of a fellow survivor who'd forgotten how to do anything but barely survive. That night they shared the fire. Dalton on one side and Kaya on the other, the cabin finally dry and the world outside gradually quieting. Neither spoke about tomorrow, about decisions that needed making or roads that led away. Instead, they sat in a silence that wasn't quite comfortable but wasn't hostile either. Just 2 people who'd stopped fighting long enough to rest. But rest never lasts. And Dalton knew that come morning, they'd have to face the question neither wanted to ask. What happened when the storm was truly over and excuses ran out? The morning broke clear, the kind of blue sky that felt like mockery after days of gray. Dalton woke to the smell of coffee he hadn't made and bacon he didn't remember having. Kaya stood at the stove, working the cast iron like she'd been doing it in this kitchen for years instead of days. She'd found flour somewhere and was making something that looked like flatbread, her movements practiced and efficient. "Where did the bacon come from?" Dalton pulled himself upright, his back screaming from days of work it wasn't used to. "The smokehouse." Kaya flipped the bread. "You had half a side hanging there, probably forgot about it." He had forgotten, had stopped checking the smokehouse months ago, stopped caring about food beyond what kept him functional. You went through my things. I went through our temporary shared resources. She plated the food, set it on the table. Eat. Then we need to talk. The flatbread was good, better than anything Dalton had made for himself in years. He ate in silence, aware of Kaya watching him with those assessing eyes that seemed to measure everything against some internal standard he couldn't see. When he finished, she poured more coffee and sat across from him, her hands wrapped around her own cup. The storm is over. She said it like a judge delivering a verdict, which means we need to decide what happens now. Dalton had been dreading this conversation since the first leak stopped. You should head to the nearest town. I'll give you supplies, enough to get you somewhere with actual prospects. And then what? Kaya's voice was level. Find another man who'll tolerate me, another arrangement that's really just a different kind of trap? She leaned forward. I told you I had no way back. That's still true. But more than that, I don't want to go back. Not to Fort Defiance. Not to any place where I'm a problem someone else has to solve. So, what do you want? To stay. The words came firm, definitive. Not as your wife. Not as whatever Vernon's forged papers claimed. But as someone who works this land with you. Someone who earns their keep and their place. Dalton felt something twist in his chest. Fear and hope tangled together until he couldn't tell which was which. I don't need a partner. You need something. Kaya gestured at the cabin, at him, at the years of slow decay finally halted. 3 days ago, this roof was failing. The corral was unusable. You were eating poorly and maintaining nothing. In 3 days, we've fixed what you let break for years. She paused. I'm not asking for charity. I'm proposing work, fair work. You provide shelter and food. I provide labor and knowledge. No strings. No obligations beyond that. People will talk. Even as Dalton said it, he knew it was weak. There were no people. That was the whole point of being out here. Let them. Kaya's eyes held his. I've survived worse than gossip. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of choice. Dalton thought about the years ahead, about growing older in a place that was already dying around him. Thought about what it meant to accept help from someone who understood loss the way he did. Someone who didn't expect him to be whole but didn't let him stay broken either. The South Pasture, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. It's completely overgrown. Used to graze cattle there before. He stopped, swallowed. If we're going to make this work, that needs clearing first. It's brutal work. Take weeks. Something shifted in Kaya's expression. The first hint of what might have been relief. I've done brutal work before. I know you have. And he did know. Could see it in every scar and callus, every competent movement that spoke of survival earned rather than given. But this is different. This is choosing to stay somewhere, not just surviving until you can leave. I'm choosing. Kaya stood, began clearing the plates. The question is whether you're choosing to, or if you're going to spend every day waiting for me to fail, so you have an excuse to be alone again. The accusation stung, because it was accurate. Dalton rose slowly, moved to the window, looked out at land he'd stopped seeing as anything but a place to wait for death. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. Don't know how to share space with someone again. How to care if things work or not. Then we'll both learn. Kaya came to stand beside him, not touching but present. Because I don't know how to trust that staying somewhere won't end the way everything else has. But I'm gonna try anyway. Outside, through the clean morning light, Dalton could see the repaired corral, the patched roof, the small signs that life had returned to a place he'd been letting die. And for the first time in 7 years, he felt something other than the weight of what was lost. He felt the terrifying possibility of what might still be built. All right, he said. We clear the South Pasture. See how we work together. And then, he trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Kaya did it for him. And then we see if two broken people can build something that isn't. The South Pasture was worse than Dalton remembered. Years of neglect had turned it into a tangle of brush and dead grass, the kind of mess that required brutal, methodical work with no shortcuts. They started at dawn, Dalton with a scythe, and Kaya with a handmade blade she'd pulled from her suitcase. And by noon they'd cleared maybe 1/10 of what needed doing. Dalton's hands were bleeding through the wraps he'd used. His shoulders burned with every swing. But Kaya worked beside him without complaint, her rhythm steady and relentless, and he found himself pushing harder than he had in years, just to keep pace. They didn't talk much. The work took all the breath they had. By the 3rd day, Dalton noticed patterns in how they moved together. Kaya would clear the heavier brush while he worked the dried grasses. She'd point out rocks that needed removing before they could seed, and he'd mark fence posts that would need replacing. They developed a wordless efficiency, anticipating each other's movements the way people do when survival depends on cooperation rather than competition. On the fourth day, Dalton's body finally gave up. He was lifting a particularly stubborn root when something in his back seized. Pain shooting through him so sharp he dropped to his knees. He tried to breathe through it, to stand, but his legs wouldn't obey. Kaya was beside him before he could protest, her hands checking his spine with the careful pressure of someone who'd treated injuries before. "Don't move." Her voice was calm, clinical. "You've pulled something. Maybe worse." "I'm fine." But the words came out strangled, and they both knew it was a lie. "You're not fine." She helped him to his feet with a strength that surprised him, half carrying him back to the cabin. "You pushed too hard. Your body isn't used to this kind of work anymore." Dalton wanted to argue, but the pain made thinking difficult. She got him onto the cot, disappeared, and returned with strips of cloth soaked in something that smelled like herbs. She pressed them against his back, and the coolness brought relief so immediate he nearly wept. "What is that?" he managed through gritted teeth. "Willow bark and yarrow. Reduces swelling." Her hands worked the muscles around the injury with practiced efficiency. "My mother taught me. Before everything." Dalton closed his eyes, focusing on breathing, on the slow easing of pain that came with her treatment. He'd spent 7 years avoiding any dependence on another person, and now, here he was, helpless and grateful in a way that terrified him. "You don't have to do this." "Yes, I do." Kaya's voice was matter of fact. "We're partners. That means when one falls, the other helps them stand. It's not charity. It's survival." She worked in silence for a while, and Dalton found himself aware of things he'd tried not to notice before. The warmth of her hands, the smell of wood smoke that clung to her clothes, the way her hair fell forward when she concentrated. He'd been alone so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to be cared for, to have someone's attention focused on his well-being rather than his utility. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for making you work so hard, for testing whether you'd break." Kaya's hands stilled. "I wasn't going to break. I know that now." Dalton opened his eyes, found her looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "But I needed to know it then. Needed proof you weren't just staying until something better came along." "Nothing better is coming." She resumed her work, but something in her voice had changed. "This is it. This broken ranch with a broken man who's finally trying to fix things. And somehow, that's more than I've had in years." The confession hit Dalton like a physical thing. He'd been so focused on his own pain, his own loss, that he hadn't fully grasped what Kaya's presence meant. She wasn't an intrusion on his grief. She was someone carrying grief just as heavy, choosing to set it down long enough to build something new. They were both so damaged that maybe the only way forward was together, holding each other upright until the wounds healed enough to bear weight alone. "When I can walk again," Dalton said carefully, "we finish the pasture. But we do it slower, sustainable, the kind of work that builds rather than breaks." Kaya's hands gentled on his back. "Agreed." That night she slept on the floor beside the cot, claiming she needed to check on him through the night. Dalton didn't argue, just lay in the darkness, listening to her breathe, and thought about how quickly the shape of his life had changed, how quickly alone had stopped feeling like safety and started feeling like its own kind of death. Outside, the wind carried the smell of cleared earth and possibility. Dalton was back on his feet within a week, moving carefully but moving. They returned to the pasture together, working at a pace that felt sustainable rather than punishing. The land was responding, showing hints of what it could be with proper care. Dalton found himself thinking in seasons again, planning for spring planting and fall harvest, thoughts he'd banned for years as too painful to entertain. Then Vernon Hale arrived. Dalton saw the dust from his horse while they were working the far edge of the pasture. Kaya saw it too, her body going still in a way that suggested she'd spent too much of her life watching horizons for threats. They walked back to the cabin together, neither speaking, both knowing that whatever came next would change things. Vernon dismounted with the easy confidence of a man who believed he was doing good. He was older than Dalton, weathered in a different way, with eyes that held certainty rather than doubt. "Dalton," he nodded, then turned to Kaya with something that might have been satisfaction. "And you must be the woman from the arrangement." "What arrangement?" Dalton's voice came out harder than he intended. "The one you forged my name on?" Vernon had the grace to look uncomfortable. I did what needed doing. You were dying out here alone, too stubborn to admit you needed help. When I heard about the matching service, about women needing placement, I thought you knew better than me. Dalton stepped forward. You forged legal documents, sent a woman into the wilderness based on lies. Do you understand what you did? I understand I saved you. Vernon gestured at the repaired corral, the patched roof, the evidence of work being done. Look at this place. Look at yourself. You're alive again. That wouldn't have happened if I'd left you to rot in your grief. The words stung because they held truth Dalton didn't want to acknowledge. But Kaya stepped forward before he could respond, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade through brush. You didn't save anyone. She faced Vernon directly, unafraid. You traded one person's autonomy for your own sense of righteousness. I came here believing I had a contract, an agreement made in good faith. Instead, I found a man who knew nothing about me, who wanted nothing to do with me, who had every right to send me away to die in country I didn't know. But he didn't send you away. Vernon looked between them, confused. You're still here, working together, making this place function again. Not because of your plan. Kaya's hands were steady at her sides, but Dalton could see the tension in her shoulders. Because we chose it. After your lies almost destroyed any chance we had at making something real. Vernon opened his mouth, closed it. For the first time since arriving, he looked uncertain. I only wanted to help. Then you should have asked. Dalton moved to stand beside Kaya. A deliberate statement of unity. Should have written me a letter. Should have done anything except decide my life for me. You had no right, Vernon. No matter how good your intentions. The older man's jaw tightened. So what now? You want me to reverse the arrangement? Tell the service it was fraud? The service was fraud. Kaya's voice was flat. But that's not your decision to fix. It's ours. She glanced at Dalton, something passing between them that didn't need words. We've already decided what happens next. Your involvement is finished. Vernon looked at them both, and something in his expression shifted from certainty to something closer to regret. I never meant harm. Most harm comes from good intentions. Dalton's voice softened slightly. Go home, Vernon. Don't come back unless we send for you, and don't ever make decisions for another person's life without their consent. They watched him ride away, the dust settling slowly in the afternoon light. When he was gone, Kaya turned to Dalton. He was right about one thing. We are alive again. Because we chose it. Dalton looked at the cabin, the pasture, the work they'd done together. Not because someone forced us into it. So what now? Kaya asked. The arrangement he made is fiction. There's no legal tie keeping me here. Nothing but the choice we made to try. Dalton felt the weight of the question. The way it opened up every fear he'd been carrying. She could leave now. Could walk away from this experiment in shared survival and find something easier. Something without his ghosts and failing body. But when he looked at her, he saw the same fear reflected back. The understanding that they'd both chosen something terrifying. That choice carried no guarantees, but that it was the first real thing either of them had done in years. Then we keep choosing. He said it simply, without drama. Every day we wake up and decide if this is still where we want to be. And if it ever stops being a choice, if it ever becomes a trap, we're honest about it. Kaya's expression softened fractionally. Every day. Every day. That night they worked late finishing a section of fence, and when Dalton's back started to protest, Kaya was there with the willow bark mixture without him having to ask. They'd settled into something that wasn't quite partnership and wasn't quite family, but was undeniably real. Two broken people learning how to hold something together without breaking each other in the process. 6 months changed everything and nothing. The south pasture was cleared, seeded, showing the first signs of grass that would support livestock come spring. The horses ran in the repaired corral, healthy and sound. The cabin roof held against autumn storms. Dalton had gained back weight he'd lost, his movements steadier, purpose replacing the hollow routine that had sustained him through years of barely surviving. Kaya had built a small addition onto the cabin, a separate sleeping space that gave them both privacy while acknowledging the permanent nature of their arrangement. She worked the land with the same relentless efficiency she'd shown from the first day. But now there was something different in how she moved through the space. Less like a guest proving her worth, and more like someone who belonged. They were repairing the last section of fence when Dalton finally asked the question that had been building for months. Do you ever regret it? Staying here instead of finding somewhere with more people? More life. Kaya set down her hammer, looked at him with those steady eyes that had learned to soften around the edges. I had more people once, had a whole community. It didn't save anyone. She picked up a nail, examined it. This place has one person who sees me as I am, not as a problem or a symbol or a thing to be managed. That's more than I thought I'd ever have again. Dalton felt something in his chest release, a tension he'd been carrying since the day she arrived. I see you, he said quietly. See how hard you work. How you fixed everything I'd let break. How you're trying to build a future in a place I'd turned into a tomb. We're building it, Kaya corrected gently. You're the one who chose to let me stay, who worked beside me even when your body couldn't handle it, who trusted me enough to be vulnerable. She paused. That takes more courage than isolation ever did. They finished the fence in silence. And when the last rail was secure, Dalton stepped back to survey what they'd accomplished. The ranch looked like a working property again, the kind of place that suggested people with plans for tomorrow, rather than people waiting for yesterday to stop hurting. It would never erase what he'd lost, would never bring back the wife and son who should have been here to see it, but it was something new, built from the wreckage of two broken lives into something that functioned. That served. That mattered. That evening they sat on the porch together, watching the sunset over land that was finally producing again. Kaya had her leather working in her lap, hands busy with the constant need to create. Dalton had his coffee, hot and bitter the way he liked it. They didn't need to fill the silence with words anymore. Had learned that presence was its own kind of conversation. I was thinking, Dalton said eventually, about getting more cattle. We've got the grazing for it now. Could make this place profitable again if we work it right. Kaya's hands stilled. We? We. Dalton met her eyes. Equal partners. Equal say. Equal share of whatever we build. He paused. If that's what you want. She was quiet for a long moment, and Dalton felt the weight of everything unsaid between them. They'd never discussed love, never addressed the way his heart had started to notice things like how she laughed at the horse's antics, or how her hair caught the light. They'd built something more fundamental than romance, something based on respect and shared labor and the daily choice to show up for each other. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. Equal partners, Kaya finally said, and there was something in her voice that suggested she understood all the words he hadn't spoken. I want that. Dalton nodded, a weight lifting he hadn't known he was carrying. They sat together as darkness fell, two people who'd survived their worst days to find something neither had been looking for. The rancher who'd lived alone for years had learned that isolation wasn't protection. It was just another kind of death. And the woman who'd arrived at his door with nothing but a leather suitcase and forged papers had proven that survival wasn't about enduring. It was about choosing to build even when everything you'd built before had been torn down. The land stretched out before them, full of work yet to be done and seasons yet to come. And for the first time in longer than either could remember, tomorrow felt like a promise instead of a threat. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier, where courage and fate collide in unexpected ways. Don't forget to subscribe and consider leaving a super chat to help us keep bringing you stories like these. Your support means everything.